Welcome back. This is Andy, and this is the Poor Proles Almanac. Last week, we discussed biochar. What exactly is it, and what the research says about its application? Turns out biochar is far more complicated than some might suggest. Today, we sit down with Kathleen Draper, a board member at the International Biochar Institute and chair of IBI's Information Hub. She is also the U.S. director of the Ithaca Institute for Carbon Intelligence. The Institute is an open-source network focusing on beneficial carbon sequestration strategies, which simultaneously provide economic development opportunities both in the developed and developing world. She's also an editor and writer for the Biochar Journal, sponsored by the Ithaca Institute. Kathleen also works with various universities and individuals on projects that are investigating the use of biochar in things from cement and other building products to wastewater remediation. She has written extensively about various topics related to biochar and is a co-author of the book Terra Preta: How the World's Most Fertile Soils Can Help Reverse Climate Change and Reduce World Hunger. So, needless to say, I had a lot of questions to be answered after some of the confusing data on biochar, and she has plenty of answers. This is a really hopeful conversation, and I can't help but walk away feeling more confident about the application of biochar in our future. If you've ever wondered about biochar as a carbon storage method, or how to think differently about how we process our waste products, then this episode really is for you. To learn more about IBI, check out the links in the show notes. And without any further ado, here's my chat with Kathleen. Kathleen, thanks so much for joining us. Biochar is like this really interesting thing that exists in the agricultural space. It's really interesting when people find these technologies and then start doing really cool research on it, which is kind of what the International Biochar Institute does. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with this organization and what the organization does?
Sure, and thanks for the invitation. I've been involved in the biochar industry for just over a decade now. I learned about it when I was doing a master's in Vermont on managing for sustainability, and I jumped in very naively to see what I could do to participate and help the industry. And IBI has been around longer than that, but I became involved with the organization in about 2015, 16, something like that, as a board member, and I'm currently the board chair. And one of the things we try to do is try to disseminate information from a trustworthy source. We've developed standards so people understand, what kind of biochar could be used in soils. And we are developing training to address the boom in the biochar industry.
Awesome. Yeah, that's one of the things that was interesting to me is for a lot of people that are, homesteading or farming or just trying to garden in their backyard, you hear about biochar and this, the wonders of biochar, and you can very quickly go on YouTube or whatever and see these videos, and it seems very simple, and it in some ways is, but then you look at the research on it and it becomes very clear it's not that simple. You'll see studies that one study will say biochar increased production 30%, another one will be like there was no difference, and some will say it was actually worse. So there's much more to it, and it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It's just a little bit more complicated than that.
Very much so.
Yeah, and what you guys basically do is try to find ways to show viable utilization for biochar, which I think is really important. It's one thing to say it works. It's another thing to say, to try to sell it, I guess, in some capacity as this thing for YouTube or whatever. But providing a framework of how to use it is what I thought really stood out about the stuff on the website for IBI. It's just you could go through and see all these different applications. The one that stood out to me, and I know we'd spoken earlier, and then you said it wasn't really your expertise, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit about it, is the Kontiki, which is basically making moonshine, but instead it's using wood instead of fermented liquid, which is this really interesting way to use. Usually it seems like we want to generate heat from burning the wood to heat someone's house, but also get this byproduct of biochar and then a tertiary byproduct, in this case being essential oil distillation. So could you talk just a little bit about this idea of taking advantage of the fact that making biochar is very energy intensive, but leveraging that energy intensiveness into secondary and tertiary uses.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges with a tool like a Kontiki. It is a bit challenging, but there are some ways that have been found to utilize it. Cooking might be, the simplest, but there was an effort in Nepal a few years back to use the heat from a soil Kontiki kiln to harvest that heat to distill the essential oils. And I forget what the leaves were that they used. I don't know how often they've done that since then, but it worked. One of the challenges is you have to have a fairly consistent, long lasting heat for that kind of scenario. So you had to get all sorts of biomass right next to the cone beforehand and make sure you were feeding the fire and things like that. Another use of the heat in the Kontiki, I worked with a student team a couple of years ago, and they created kind of like a wort chiller that you could put inside the cone, the metal kiln, and we used it for hot water heating. And then another use, a guy in Serbia has a heat exchanger on top of it or over it, not right on top of it. And he heats his warehouse with that. And he's turned it into a continuous feed whereby there's an auger at the bottom of the kiln so he can keep drawing out the biochar and adding more biomass on top. So there are a few people who have figured out a way to use the heat.
I know some folks that do something similar with the water circulation with wood stoves, and utilizing that for biochar at the same time. I mean, makes a lot of sense. It's something I do personally when I make biochar. I have like a little hotel pan that I'll throw little wood chips in, throw it in the wood stove because it's heating the house anyway, and you're taking full advantage of that fire that you've already got going. I think that's really where biochar shines, is when you can use it when there's already a use for that extended heat service anyway. Despite that, the challenge then becomes, as we were just discussing, that it's much more complicated than just shoving some wood in something nearly airtight into heat. But the length of the heat, the temperature of the heat, the change in the temperature of the heat, the material that you're putting in all impact what that biochar is and the properties that it has in terms of its usage, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. In certain situations, the indigenous cultures from thousands of years ago figured out a very simple way to make it and use it. And so in those scenarios, I think converting it into biochar and using it in soils is great. And it's not as particular as some people sometimes make it out to be. But if you are selling a product and making claims that your water holding capacity in your soils is going to increase by X, then you have to make sure that's true with your particular biochar. So that's where a lot of confusion is happening in the marketplace, is that a lot of people making biochar don't actually understand the nuances in the physical, chemical, electromagnetic properties. And so they make wild claims about their biochar being able to do whatever's been claimed in the name of biochar and do it better than every other biochar out there.
Sure. Yeah. And I think especially when we're talking about like traditional indigenous usages of biochar, just because it might not seem very scientific to us, chances are they'd know within a very narrow margin what that temperature is that a fire is running and how long it's been there, and based on the water content of the wood before they put it in, what temperature it needed to be at, and all of these things that from an observer's perspective might seem like they're just throwing, they're burying some wood in a hole with a fire near it. And there's much more going on than we understand because, it's like when somebody that's never spent time outdoors looks at a forest and they see the forest, and somebody that's a forager looks and they see the acorns and all the things that are important to them. We have that outsider's perspective where we're not seeing a lot of the nuance
Correct.
that's happening in these processes, and through our own Western science, trying to discern those differences through trial and error, which unfortunately sometimes people get ahead of because they see the hot new product that will fix all of your problems.
Mhm. Yes, guilty. The industry definitely has that bent, some of us anyway.
Yeah, and one thing I know you do have some good experience with is the idea of septic system designed with biochar. And this is a really cool thing because I have a 50-year-old septic tank that I know before I ever move. will have to get replaced, and I'm dreading it for a number of reasons. But the idea of utilizing something like biochar is seems like a really good way to leverage the fact that in reality, septic tanks are massive nutrient dumps, and that they're going basically totally underused. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, a year and a half ago or so, I started construction on a new house. And through the process of speaking with the civil engineer who designed my septic system and drain fields, I asked him if I could put biochar in without going against regulations. And at first, I don't think he had a clue about biochar, but it was obviously he'd done a bunch of research on it and came back to me and told me exactly how we could do it without getting in trouble. And what we ended up doing is for each of the 6 drain lines that I think are 50 feet long and maybe a foot across, I forget the actual measurements, we dug about 3 or 4 inches deeper than was required in the plans, and we put a layer of biochar down in each of the drain lines. So I have about a ton of biochar, and then on top of that is the gravel, and then on top of that is a blend of the topsoil and sand. So that was legit, but I think if we could get the laws changed, I think it would be even better. Instead of hauling in 6 or 8 truckloads of sand, to use sand in some of the mix above the gravel, because I think that would help, especially in certain parts of the world, to hold water longer and things like that. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any testing going on with the septic system. But my whole reason for doing it was, one, to sequester carbon, but also when I realized that you're just putting gravel and then your subsoil, you're just dumping all sorts of things into your subsoil. And I live near a lake, and I thought there's a better way to design this. So,
If you don't mind me asking, how much more did it cost to design it like that?
well, to be honest, I got the biochar donated by somebody who was interested in having this done. So, what would a ton of biochar cost these days? It's usually sold by volume rather than weight. And so I had 3 super sacks. So it might be $1,000 more right now.
It's good to know.
Yeah.
The website talks extensively about some of the benefits of biochar, and we actually had talked a little bit before we started recording that there's some really promising research going on in terms of its ability to help clean polluted sites. Could you talk a little bit about that?
One of the areas of interest commercially is in remediating old mine lands or abandoned oil wells. So, depending on what you're trying to achieve, you would need different types of biochar. So, we know that a certain kind might help sorb arsenic, and a different kind might help with cadmium or lead or things like that. But one of the really interesting things that I did a webinar on years ago was using it in cacao plantations that were in Peru that had too much cadmium, and they were losing the whole market to Europe because they had increased their regulations about the cadmium content. And they'd been given 5 years to figure out how to help that problem, and nothing worked until they started using biochar around existing trees, and it was able to immobilize sufficient amounts of cadmium so that it met the new regulations. I think it's not as utilized in that way as it could be and should be, but I think with things like PFAS in soils, we're going to start seeing a lot more attention paid to ways to remediate agricultural soils on top of, the mine land reclamation.
Yeah, I mean, as we record this, the town I live in just put in a heavy drought water ban where all we can use is water for indoors and livestock. We're recording in July, and August is our dry month,
Wow.
and we're not considered a dry part of the country, which is, as somebody that spends a lot of time outside, I've been like telling people like we're in a drought, and there was no notice of it until recently, and it's only going to get worse. And I think it speaks to the fact that even though climate change predictions have said this area was going to become more wet in the future, it's going to be more complicated than that. And that means we need to have a lot more tools at our disposal, whether it's access to water that's clean or things like biochar to make that water clean. And I think that's where a lot of this research and the resources going to it offer a lot of promise in terms of salvaging landscapes that have been decimated by industrialism. And the place I live, you can't eat freshwater fish because of the amount of metals that are in the water, and that's just like it's disheartening and frightening in a lot of ways when you think about
Yeah.
it, because that water is leaching into everything, the plants, the everything. You can't get away from it, especially with like PFAs. It seems like this is like this time bomb that we didn't know about.
Mhm.
And I can only imagine if this is one of those things in 20, 30 years is going to be everywhere the way we look at lead now. The fact that biochar seems to offer some capacity to limit the damages or to at least to do something about this issue is really hopeful. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit more about that particular piece, because I've never heard anything about that.
Yeah, well, as I said before, we're in the process of publishing an opinion piece on that IBI. We hired somebody to review the literature, but there's a couple of ways that it can help. One is by carbonizing the material that has it, such as sewage sludge, so that it's not land applied. They found that at certain temperatures, it can destroy the PFAS. So it's not in the biochar, it's not in the air, it's in the filter. So they have to figure out what to do with that filter, obviously. But there's research showing that it can help immobilize the PFAS in the soil and also harvest it in water. So I think that paper should be out. There's also a session about it in the upcoming USBI Biochar conference in West Virginia next month. So more soon.
Awesome. When this comes out, that will have already happened. So hopefully only good things came from it. Hey there, it's Andy from the Poor Proles Almanac. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast. As you can probably tell, this content involves extensive research and editing to release weekly episodes. If you think this content is valuable for the future that we inherit, please consider financially supporting this project by visiting poorproles.com and clicking on the Patreon, Venmo, Ko-Fi, or PayPal tabs. Every dollar helps offset our costs for hosting the podcast content and helps offset hundreds of hours of work put towards this project monthly. Thank you for supporting us by sharing, liking, and donating to this project. Together, we can build a better future. It's interesting that it's in West Virginia in coal country where you guys are deciding to do that. Was that coincidental? Is there a lot more support in those regions because of the impacts of industrialization and pollution, or is that just coincidence?
There is a biomass energy project housed, I think, at West Virginia University. And so we're partnering with them for a bioenergy biochar conference. So that's how West Virginia got selected.
One of the things that I always feel concerned about when we talk about like these things, that it's like, oh, this can solve this major issue. How viable is it really to say, or how realistic would it be to say, like, we can use this technology to do this thing that we think is like great? Like, is it actually something that we could scale to a capacity to like solve some of these problems?
It's scaling now. It's still quite small. The estimate in the US for biochar production is maybe 100,000 tons a year, so tiny. But what's really interesting is to see what the effect of biochar being listed on the carbon removal marketplace has done to push production. Mind you, the issue is really you have to sell the biochar for a carbon preserving purpose to really get those carbon credits. But there's so much demand for carbon removal credits, and biochar is one of the few that's actually out there available. So we're seeing the opportunity to scale, but in parallel, we have to build the markets where it's going to work economically. And, we've tried the farming market for a decade or more, and the value proposition has been a tough sell to a lot of farmers. It's really starting to boom out in California, where they have water scarcity and where biochars can help. And higher value agriculture is obviously more able to afford it. But selling it to corn farmers in the Midwest is not easy right now. One, because they need massive amounts of it, and the price point isn't there yet.
Yeah, the margins are small.
Yeah, they are. But that's starting to change. We are also seeing government support for it. The Natural Resource Conservation Service is coming out with a soil carbon amendment protocol where they will be paying farmers to increase soil carbon, and biochar is one of those solutions. It's called Code 336, and that's another thing that's going to be debuting at the Biochar conference. Is they'll be talking about what that program looks like, and how much you could get to help put biochar in your soils.
It's one of those things, like I said, it's like, all right, are we fundamentally looking at a different future in the sense of how we relate with how our water is cleaned, how our food is grown, and that seems so hard for us to imagine. I think we struggle through this the lens of our own individual experiences. Like we can look back 3 generations and see that food was grown completely differently 3 generations ago here, and our diet was completely different. But because we're caught in our place and time, it's hard to see that. It's hard to think that there was a time when our diet wasn't half corn. It's hard to then conversely say if I can envision a future where biochar is just like as normal as fertilizer is today and as utilized as plastics and air filtration and water filtration being all replaced with biochar.
Mm.
It's really hard to envision that, even if it's something we could actually do.
Yeah, I agree. It is hard. Although I will say I live in a heavily populated area with Mennonites. And so you do sort of see some of the older techniques. And they hosted a biochar education event maybe a year and a half ago. And they had 150 people there. 99% were Mennonites. And they are really interested in it because it can be locally produced. It is more natural. So that what was really surprising and heartening to attend that event.
Yeah, that's absolutely hopeful. Unfortunately, they're not key stakeholders in what our food system or all these other infrastructural systems look like. But I think the interest in finding natural alternatives, it obviously exists because of the fact that otherwise a lot of these like snake oil salesmen around like natural products wouldn't exist if people weren't desperate for something that was, fundamentally different, whether it's disinterest in plastics or concern about health because of all these issues people are having today, or whether it's just we can't continue to live like this, which I don't think it's easy to you start thinking about plastics that you've used since the day you were born, and the fact that most of them are probably sitting somewhere either in a dump someplace or in an ocean patch someplace. That capacity, when you start thinking about it, if that's every single person on the earth and every person in the future, like that can't continue. It pretty fundamentally, like there's limits to that usage. We need to start thinking about alternatives before it's too late, and that's where I think biochar, even if it is, like I said, overhyped by like YouTube personalities and things like that, does have a lot of opportunity to answer some of these questions and to fill some of these spaces in the way we consume, whether it's materials or just infrastructural things and things like that. Now, I know you talked a little bit about the food piece. I was really interested in the fact that when I was reading academic research versus some of the stuff you guys were doing, sometimes there was some interesting divisions in terms of like biochar applications. So, like one example was in the city of Stockholm, they basically planted trees in pure biochar. And like when you look at like academic research, it was like, oh, we used 1% to 5%, maybe 10% if they're feeling a little crazy. And then like Stockholm, they're like, no, we're just going to throw a tree in biochar. And I thought that was like just interesting. And, I was curious about your thoughts about that. And like if science and academia is like maybe not challenging biochar enough, if that makes sense.
Well, I will say I took a group of people to Stockholm a few years ago for a biochar study tour, and they may have tried that, but they don't do it that way, generally speaking. It's a structured soil with gravel and biochar and compost. And it was interesting because we saw this being done, and they literally scrape all of the soil away. Then they do put a layer of pure biochar on the bottom, but then they have what look like black rocks. It's pre-blended gravel, biochar, and compost. I think it's an 80-10-10 mixture. And that's to hold the trees in, but they put nothing on top of it. So what you see are black rocks. And they're even putting it in driving areas. And the idea really is to cleanse the water coming off the roads and the roofs, and to increase infiltration. because they're right on the water there. And they didn't do it that way initially, but that has become one of the things that they're most interested in, as well as extending the life of trees.
Yeah, it's such a cool thing, and I imagine that must look really awesome, like in person. Like it almost looks like super futuristic, modern. Like you just this rock, this black pathway where trees are growing out of it.
Yeah, yeah, it's smart. The guy who started that he's retired now, the tree officer, but he used to grow orchids, and so he had experience using charcoal in orchid growing, and then all of a sudden heard of this thing called biochar, and they started importing it from all over Europe, testing different types of biochar, and then they got this funding from Bloomberg to purchase a small pyrolysis unit and convert their green waste and use that. But they are still using much more than they produce right now. So that's one of the biggest uses of biochar in Scandinavia right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's one of those things I think even if it doesn't work, it's going to provide some really good insight into its utilization and capacity. I think that's sometimes something we're afraid to do is kind of go all out, so to speak, and just be like, let's just see if it works. It might not,
Right.
but we're going to find out. We're not just going to mess around with 1% versus 5%, which there's nothing wrong with those studies. They're really helpful in starting to understand some of the nuance, but also like we should know the point of which it doesn't work anymore at all. And there's something to be said for putting yourself out there
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. One of the projects I'm working on right now is putting biochar in drywall, and we're trying to understand what that point is. Because usually when you put it in concrete, it's pretty small amount, although concrete is used in enormous quantities. But that's what we're trying to find out. What's the level first when you're at net zero, but then when you can no longer meet the current performance standards of something like drywall. And it's more than you might think, but it really depends on the type of biochar and things like particle size and stuff like that. So we have a lot to learn, but it's fascinating to just dive into some of these areas.
Yeah. Now, speaking of drywall, does biochar have any like insulatory properties?
It depends on the biochar, but we made a composite that's not drywall, but it has the same R value as expanded polystyrene.
That's awesome.
It's completely not cost effective at the moment, but it's promising. We had a small grant to look at thermal insulation packaging. So we tried a bunch of different composites and tested them for R value, and one of them came out to be really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, rock wool is basically a similar idea, and it's incredibly good at what it does. So it does make sense that biochar would also offer some similar benefits.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. The idea of like being able to build a house that is like actually sustainable, not in the sense of like energy, but in the sense of the materials used, is really inspiring to me personally. So the idea that you could do that is pretty cool.
Yeah, not that your listeners can see, but that's my biochar wall over there. It's just lime and biochar, which I put too much biochar in. I learned because some of it needs a little repair already in a year. But yeah, my whole concept with the house I just built was how many different ways can you sequester carbon. Biochar is one of them, obviously, but there's many ways. The panels behind me are recovered fence boards, and I have all wood paneling, and so yeah, it's a challenge, but it's doable.
Yeah, and I think it's through the trial and error that will make more sustainable future possible. Somebody has to do the work, and in this case, it's you.
Yeah, but there's more and more people trying it out. I was speaking to some folks in South Africa yesterday and the Gambia, and they are working on biochar bricks so that they don't use as much sand, which, they're building these resorts on beaches, but using the sand to to make the concrete, and then they have nothing for the people to see and stand on. It's crazy.
Yeah, that could be a challenge. Now, for most of our listeners, I mean, they can't invest in biochar production facilities that are at scale and capable of producing consistent, specific results. If somebody wants to do more biochar stuff, what are your recommendations for somebody that wants to get into trying to do this themselves?
For their own personal use?
Yes.
Well, really, you can do it in a hole in the ground. And I have done that more than once. But you can get low cost kilns as well, either the cone kiln type or the top lit updraft. You can make them yourself too. And I was making biochar not too long ago from dried weeds, and it's going to make a decent biochar, but what I'm using it for now is for the bokashi bran, which, it's something you can toss in your compost or use it for new planting beds. So it's very manageable to do at a very small scale with little money.
The weeds thing is a cool concept. I definitely have gotten into like sunflower stalk char because people will use it as an extract for like potassium and things like that because of what the stalks are primarily made of. So like utilizing being able to extract the mineral piece while also being able to continue to use it as like a biochar is like seems like a win-win. And again, going back to this idea of if it's energy intensive, how do you leverage that energy to get the maximum efficiency out of it? Being able to get these multiple products out of it, fertilizer and a biochar, and in some cases maybe heat for your house, or maybe it's instead of having a fire in your backyard with your friends, you have the biochar going, and it's basically the same thing.
Right.
There's a lot of ways we can start to think about how we can leverage the resources we have to be able to do something that's carbon neutral or at least somewhat beneficial for the ecology around us.
Yes. There are some smaller kilns coming out that are for heating greenhouses, but they're still kind of in the $40,000 to $50,000 range, I think, because the price of steel has just gone crazy. So they're not being mass produced yet either, but there are some pretty big equipment manufacturers that are getting interested in biochar. And once that happens, I think we'll see some more affordable technologies where the heat can be harvested.
Yeah, yeah. I always think about wood stoves because here in the United States, I'm guessing you probably have a wood stove. You seem like the kind of person that would have a wood stove. So like you have a wood stove, and the United States is so behind the rest of the world and what that technology looks like. And I imagine that if this were to be something that took off and became more of a common thing that people did the same way you cook food at home, you also make biochar at home, like creating wood stoves that were designed to be able to do that would be like incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
I'm not optimistic I'll see that in my lifetime, but it would be cool. Like, I've seen wood stoves that like you can cook on, they're designed to be cooked on. Any of these types of uses, whether it's heating the water for your house or cooking on top of your wood stove, like these additional uses are incredible and in some ways really fundamental to what the human creativity that we all have, that I think gets lost sometimes in our consumerist mentality of I buy this thing to do this thing and only that thing, and I buy this other thing that does this thing. And that's not how we have existed on the earth
True.
until the last 100,000 years. This is like a modern thing where we don't know how to use things for more than one use.
Yeah, exactly. And it gets a little overwhelming to people, I think, when you're trying to propose that, well, it's a holistic perspective.
Yeah, and I think the building codes, to go back to the hot water idea with the wood stove, become kind of a barrier for people too, because it's like, okay, yeah, I could make a wood stove that circulates hot water in it and heat my hot water for my house, but how does this fit into like a building code? And I'm not a construction person, so like it seems totally out of reach for the average person. But I think making little bits of biochar here and there is still accessible at least.
Yeah. And it's fun to learn how different types of feedstock turn into biochar, because the first time I did hemp stalks, oh my gosh, we were so unprepared because it's so dry and spindly. It goes so fast. It's the same with weeds. So you really have to be prepared. Whereas if I have a lot of lumber offcuts from my build, and those take forever to carbonize. So you learn, a lot about fire dynamics.
Yeah. Are there any particular tips or maybe misconceptions that you'd like to kind of clear up for folks that are just getting into this for the first time? Maybe like something you always see on YouTube that you're like, that's not how that works, or something that you think is kind of helpful?
Well, maybe not YouTube, because I don't spend too much time on there, but I will tell you, I was teaching coffee farmers in Colombia last year how to make biochar, and I realized I had not given them proper instructions on how to prepare the material. So we went to two different farms, and we were carbonizing the coffee tree stump. So they cut the trees every 5 or 6 years and normally just let it rot. But the first farm we went to, they cut it up into little 2-inch sections and they dried it using coal. I said, that's crazy. And then the next farm we went to, that it was probably 25% moisture content. They didn't cut it up, but it wasn't dried at all. In fact, it was way too wet to actually make biochar efficiently. So we had to go hunt around on the farm to find a dead tree standing, cut that down and get the fire started. So, you want some pretty dry biomass. You want to prepare it ahead of time. So, but not cut it in. If you're using a Kontiki cone kiln, you can't use really dense material, like wood chips are bad, but they're great for a top-lit updraft kind of kiln. So you kind of got to know what to use in different pieces of kit.
Yeah, so know your equipment.
Yeah.
Awesome. Kathleen, is there anything you would want to plug? Do you guys have social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, books? I believe you have a book, right?
I do have a book. It's called Burn, Using Fire to Cool the Earth. And I was a co-author on that with my co-author, Albert Bates. And I had another one called Terra Preta a few years ago. And I'm actually trying to write one on my own called Dwelling on Drawdown, which is all about sequestering carbon and building materials.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely want to know about that book when it comes out. And folks can find you guys on social media?
Yes, at biochar-international.org, I believe it is.
Kathleen, this has been great. I appreciate your time, and I expect to hear a lot more from you in the future.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation.